Hello learners, welcome to this video. My name is Dr. Arundita Bhanjdev and I work as a researcher in Pradhan.
Hello listeners, my name is Dr. Imran Amin and I work at Ambedkar University, Delhi.
So learners, today we are going to talk about engaging in local policy space, role of politicians and bureaucrats. You heard us in one of the previous videos where both of us introduced you to the concept of advocacy and presented to you how advocacy is related to public policy and how it is related with sustainable development. In this video, we will delve into local policy space, elaborating on the stages of advocacy and implementation of policy. We'll also hear from Imran on Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, Mahatma Gandhi Narega, as a case study to explain this local policy space in much more detail. So let us start. So briefly, let's see what we will cover in this video. We'll start with discussing what exactly is a local policy space. Then we'll talk about the actors involved in the local policy space. Then we will go on to discuss the differences in the local policy space vis-a-vis advocacy and implementation. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll explain local policy space with an example. Now Imran, let us start. So what do we mean when we speak of a local policy space?
Arundita, when we are talking of local policy space, it differs from policy to policy, as well as whether we are talking about advocacy or that we want to policy that we want to advocate for, or policy that has already been formulated and is being implemented at the grassroots level. So, when we are talking about policies that are being implemented, that have already been formulated and already exist in the policy space, the local policy space involves people for whom the policy is being implemented, or those who benefit from or are affected by the said implementation. Now, for any policy, no matter how you're looking at it, people happen to be the most fundamental space within which policy takes place. They not only shape the people who are affected by or benefit from policy, they are also the ones who are involved in the implementation of policy. Having discussed the people as a space, we also need to look at in terms of what exactly are we talking about when we are talking about the local. Are we talking about who controls the budget? Or are we talking about who allocates the budget? When we are talking about who controls the budget, we are looking at a certain level of legislation and formulation of the policy. When we are talking about who distributes the budget, we are looking at an implementation level of the policy space. Now, coming to when policies are being advocated for, the local policy space becomes very different. However, people continue to be the central figure because generating public opinion and popular support for a cause, for something that we are championing for, is fundamental. It becomes even more fundamental in electoral democracies like ours, where politicians take note of issues that have the backing of a strong public opinion. The most important factor here is to understand the politico-cultural and everyday life of a politician. How it begins with meeting people, going to the legislature, interacting with bureaucrats and trying to address concerns that people have raised with them, and in the process they get to be involved at multiple levels of the policy space. Now, coming to bureaucrats, when we are speaking of advocacy, bureaucrats become important if we are talking about bringing about a slight change in an existing policy, especially in the local policy space. However, when we are talking about formulating a new policy, bureaucrats are relevant in what we referred to as the policy formulation stage in our previous video.
Thank you, Imran. So, in this space, what are the actors involved? I mean, at this level of policy space?
See, when we are talking about the actors that are involved, we have to maintain that distinction between whether we are talking about the implementation of the policy or whether we are talking about the advocacy for the policy. Once again, people, community, and the villagers with whom we are working on any policy, whether it is for its implementation or whether it is for its advocacy, are the central actor. It is they who will decide whether an implementation will be successful, like we mentioned in our policy approaches, or it is they who will decide whether the cause that we are championing for garners enough public opinion to be qualified to graduate from being a public agenda to being a governmental agenda. Now, coming to when we are talking about implementation, the first set of actors who are involved in local policy space are the frontline workers and grassroots level bureaucrats who are involved in the implementation of any policy. They are the ones who interact with the central actor of the policy, which is the people. They interact with these people. They inform them about the various provisions and procedures of the policy that they need to follow. They inform them about various ways in which the policy can be accessed and harvested by people. So, for example, in case of Manrega, the frontline workers would be the Rojgar Sevak or Sahayak, with the block official as the lower level bureaucrat. On the political level, or on the politicians level, taking the same example of Manrega, the Sarpanch or the Pradhan, depending on where we are in this country, of the PRI system becomes the most obvious actor. However, the frontline worker or the bureaucrat would change if we shift our focus from implementation of the policy to those controlling the budget or allocating the budget. Now, in case of those who control the budget, the Zilla Parishad and the district level department that is primary for implementation of the policy becomes important. On the other hand, while we are talking about the latter, which is about budget allocators or who decide how much money from the budget should go under which policy, the MLAs and the MPs and the principal secretaries of state level or central level, depending on whether we are looking at state policies or whether we are looking at central policies, become important. For advocacy concerns, the actors will include individuals, groups and organizations that champion the cause of any given policy that they want to promote, and at the same time, it will depend on who is it that they think needs to be their allies and their collaborators. That will have a huge say in shaping the actors that are present in local policy space. Also, being able to put a cause that they are championing or a cause that they're doing advocacy for into the election manifesto of any political party is critical step for advocacy, and those involved in formulation of electoral manifestos or collecting informations to formulate electoral manifestos become yet another important actor at the local level of electoral politics. So when we are talking about local and level, it varies from whether we are talking about the implementation of the policy or whether we are talking about advocating for the policy, whether we are talking about those who implement it or those who control the budget or those who allocate the budget for the said policies.
Yeah, so that was an elaborate glimpse of the multiple actors, as you said, Imran, involved at the various stages of the policy. As you already mentioned, Manrega, could you explain this further with using Manrega in terms of advocacy and then in terms of implementation in a little bit more detail?
See, MG Narega is actually a very good example of not just how policy works, but also in terms of understanding how a policy that starts with being advocated for and being championed for goes on to become a policy, and then the actors who are involved in when you are implementing the policy. So, the case of Manrega began with the Right to Food campaign. The Right to Food campaign conceptualized what was then referred to as an Employment Guarantee Act as a part of an assemblage of 5 measures to fight extreme poverty and hunger, which included midday meals, which included access to food. All these were a part of the agenda for Right to Food campaign. However, the seed for Employment Guarantee Act was rooted in a writ petition that was filed by People's Union for Civil Liberty of Rajasthan in April 2001 to the Supreme Court of India. The petition led to a public interest litigation which demanded the government to do something after a series of drought left many people hungry in the state of Rajasthan. Based on the fact that there was abundance of food grains available in the godowns of the government, and yet people were dying of hunger, the Supreme Court directed the government to implement all the schemes related to food security. Now, given the fact that in India, the decisions of the Supreme Court are treated as law, each of these schemes effectively became a legal entitlement. This was a huge success for the Right to Food campaign. Energized by this success of the campaign on school feeding, the Right to Food campaign started working on Environmental Guarantee Act. Now, the employment was already high on the agenda, especially in the wake of a series of droughts that happened in Rajasthan in the early 2000s. And the Right to Food campaign collaborated with and rallied behind the Congress party in Rajasthan to take up this cause. However, the Congress party lost the election of Rajasthan. And yet, because Congress party had a system of meeting chief ministers of various states, and Right to Food campaign could have access to those meetings. Slowly, and Congress party organized a specific meeting to discuss Employment Guarantee Act, which was chaired by Dr. Manmohan Singh, who would go on to become the Prime Minister of this country after the 2004 election. The Right to Food campaign was able to insert the Employment Guarantee Act into the election manifesto of the Congress party first, and then with the support of left organizations into what came to be called the National Common Minimum Program. Now, this National Common Minimum Program was supposed to be the governance agenda of the United Progressive Alliance, or the UPA, which formed the government in 2004. Being included in the National Common Minimum Program was the first step. But what really helped the cause for Employment Guarantee Act was the constitution of what you call, now come to know as, the National Advisory Council, which was headed by Sonia Gandhi, who was the chairperson of the Congress party. Now, because the National Advisory Council had Sonia Gandhi as the chairperson who had access to the Prime Minister, underpassing or undercutting all bureaucratic process, the Right to Fight Food campaign had a very effective ally. They could straight away reach the Prime Minister through this National Advisory Council. Now, even then, there was enough political and bureaucratic negotiation between various members and cabinet members and cabinet secretaries for and against them. So, to continue working on the act and on the bill that was supposed to become the act, the Right to Food campaign adopted two strategies. First, it was working with the state to bring about changes and insert its own demands within the bill by building coalitions with powerful political persons, parties, as well as bureaucrats. At the same time, it used what is called as pressure tactics by launching a huge signature campaign to solicit nationwide public support for the act. Now, like I said, strong public opinion is fundamental to any advocacy or implementation initiative. The signature campaign collected 1 million signatures from 400 out of the 500 districts of India at that point of time. They also launched what came to be called the Rozgar Adhikar Yatra, which culminated in a public forum where members from all political parties were called to state and declare the stand that they had on Employment Guarantee Act. This generated a substantial media interest. While the colloquial Hindi media newspapers were championing for this, the English newspapers were having their doubts. Yet, because of this dual approach of working with the government and creating pressure on the government through popular mobilization, the bill was finally passed on 23rd August 2005 with 100% majority and came into effect on 2nd February 2006.
So, Imran, we are completely glued to the story of the Act coming to existence. So, can you, briefly now also describe the next steps in terms of implementation, like we discussed earlier, like who were the actors in this Manrega policy after it was passed?
See, so after the Manrega was passed, there was this group of National Advisory Council members who championed the cause of Manrega, who were included into the chief executing body of Manrega. The first thing that they did was they got the act extended to cover from 200 districts in 2006 and 7 when it was first implemented to all rural areas by April 2008. At the same time, the advocacy group focused on ensuring that people were aware about the key factors and features of the Act, like it involved issues of time-bound employment guarantee. So, the Act said that once you have registered yourself as an unemployed person with the government official, you are supposed to get daily physical wage labor within 15 days. And if you're unable to get that provision within 15 days, you're supposed to get unemployment allowance for it. Now, most people to begin with weren't necessarily aware of this. And the first thing that the advocacy groups did was to generate huge public awareness campaigns about this provision. Then came the issue of transfer of these wages to the people and opening their accounts in banks and post offices so that the money could be directly transferred into their accounts. The third was the question of gender representation and gender equality. Now, provisions of the Act provided for 1/3 of the total workforce employed within Manrega to be women who had to be paid equal wages and there had to be equal opportunities for elderly and disabled people as well. To manage all this, to keep track of all these provisions and implementations that were happening, an extensive management information system or MIS was set up to do a real-time tracking of beneficiaries involved, wages paid, the kind of work that was being undertaken. At the same time, a bottom-up approach to policy implementation was highlighted by making the Panchayati Raj institutions the principal implementing agencies, with participatory planning and monitoring through social or community social audits that were contextually appropriate. This bottom-up approach was to allow the people to have a say in how the implementation takes place. Now, it is this provision of the bottom-up approach that saw some major involvement of the advocacy group, apart from the awareness campaigns that they were engaged in. So when we are speaking of the involvement of advocacy groups in this bottom-up participatory approach of implementation, advocacy, evaluation and monitoring of the MNREGA, Andhra Pradesh was the front runner. In fact, they were the ones who took it up upon themselves to facilitate the development of civil society organizations and conduct capacity building trainings for them to conduct social audits. It was this model that was later expanded to different areas. At the same, now, areas that had a substantial presence of civil society actors had a lot of success with social audits and advocacies of this kind. So in Rajasthan, there was a vibrant advocacy network and civil society organizations like Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan and Suchna Evam Rozgar Adhikar Abhiyan that spearheaded the conducting of social audits and Jan Sunwais or public hearings to track government spending. In Orissa, civil society organizations unionized themselves to form Orissa Shramjeevi Union or Orissa Workers Union to strengthen the bargaining power of the workers vis-a-vis the state agency.
So Imran, you've been talking about social audits or Jan Sunwais. Can you share a little bit about what are these social audits or Jan Sunwais for our learners to understand more?
When we talk of social audits or Jan Sunwais, the idea is to ensure people have a say in holding government officials accountable for implementing the policy, spending, how much they are spending in the implementation of the policy, the kind of work that is being undertaken, whether did the people and the panchayat and the Gram Sabha have a say in those, did women participate to the levels that they are expected to and supposed to participate. Now, by making people the body to which the government and the bureaucrats and the politicians and various actors that we spoke about of the local policy space accountable to, it was a drastic measure. It was a huge measure of decentralized participatory governance where implementing actors and actors who were involved in budget allocations or in control of the budget or in the spending of the budget or in deciding whether the work register is maintained or not or whether there is creche for women or not, were actually being held accountable to the people for a change and not to a senior bureaucrat that is normally the case with other policies. So Jan Sunwais or social audits was this measure to make implementing agencies and implementing authorities accountable to the people.
So thank you, Imran. So dear learners, this brings us to the end of this video. We heard in great detail about the local policy space and specifically the stages of advocacy and implementation. Hope you have also gained a lot of insights from this video. Now here's an exercise for you. Just like we spoke about, Imran shared about Manrega, just take up any government scheme, a social security program, and just find out about the local policy space. Who are the actors involved at the advocacy stage? Who are the actors involved at the implementation stage? Here are a few references that we have used to make this video, and which you will also find at the end of your chapter. These are our partners and collaborators with whom we have made this whole course, and thank you, learners.